The charity gala had gone perfectly until I saw them together. I stood frozen at the entrance to the balcony, champagne flute halfway to my lips, watching my husband of 18 years as he tenderly tucked a strand of hair behind another woman's ear. There was an intimacy to the gesture that made my stomach drop. They hadn't noticed me yet. In the soft glow of the string lights, I could see how his fingers lingered against her cheek, how her eyes closed briefly at his touch. "I'll make it work somehow," I heard Richard say, his voice carrying in the night air. "Olivia doesn't need to know yet. I just need more time." I didn't drop the glass. I didn't scream. I simply took a mental photograph of that moment. My successful surgeon husband with a young hospital administrator, her hand now resting on his chest, and backed away silently. As I retreated into the crowded ballroom of the Langford Hotel, I already knew this wouldn't end like he expected. My name is Olivia Reed, and this is how I dismantled my life to rebuild it entirely on my terms. 3 months earlier. "Are you coming home for dinner tonight?" I asked, phone pressed between my ear and shoulder as I selected fresh produce at the farmer's market. It was a beautiful spring Saturday, and I was planning to make Richard's favorite roasted vegetable risotto. "Can't tonight, Liv. The Morrison case is complicated, 70-year-old with a tricky aortic valve. I need to review everything before Monday's surgery." His voice had that distracted quality it always had when he was looking at something else while talking to me. I sighed quietly. "That's the 3rd weekend this month, Rich." I know. Being chief of cardiothoracic surgery comes with responsibilities. You understand, right? We'll do something special next weekend, I promise." I did understand. I'd been understanding for nearly 2 decades. When we met at Northwestern, I was pursuing my master's in art history while he was drowning in medical school. I'd supported him through residency, fellowship, and the grueling climb to departmental chief at Boston Memorial. I'd built my own career as a museum curator around his demanding schedule, and we'd created a life that, while not perfect, felt solid and meaningful. "Fine," I conceded, picking up a bunch of asparagus. "Text me if you finish early." After hanging up, I adjusted my shopping, buying enough for just one. Again, that evening, as I ate alone at our dining table, a beautiful antique piece we'd found in Vermont on our 10th anniversary, I scrolled through our recent text messages. The pattern was clear. Richard was present less and less. At first, I'd attributed it to his new position. 12-hour surgeries, board meetings, grant proposals. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite name. I'd just turned 43. Richard was 45. We'd decided years ago that children weren't in our future. Instead, we'd built a life of travel, art, good food, and meaningful careers. Our Back Bay townhouse was filled with memories from our adventures: Moroccan lanterns, Italian pottery, Japanese prints. But lately, it had started to feel like a museum to a life we once shared, rather than a home we were actively building together. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Elena. "Still on for morning yoga?" I smiled. Absolutely. "Need to clear my head." Elena had been my rock since college. Unlike me, she'd married and divorced twice, approaching each transition with humor and resilience. "Life's too short for slow deaths," she'd say, meaning relationships that lingered past their expiration date. That night, I couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., I checked Richard's location on my phone, still at the hospital. I called the cardiothoracic floor, something I rarely did. "Boston Memorial, 7 West," answered a tired-sounding nurse. "Hi, this is Olivia Reed, Dr. Reed's wife. Is he still there?" "He's not answering his phone." A pause. "Dr. Reed?" "He left around 10, Mrs. Reed." My heart skipped a beat. "Oh, he must be in another department. Thanks." I hung up, staring at the map on my phone showing his location at the hospital. I zoomed in. The DA was actually not in the main building but in the adjacent staff parking garage. Either he'd forgotten his phone in the car, or I didn't finish the thought. The following week, I found myself paying more attention. Richard came home late, smelling of hospital soap but also something else, a light, floral scent that wasn't mine. His explanations grew more detailed, as if rehearsed. And he stopped leaving his phone unattended, taking it with him even to the shower. Classic signs, Elena would say. But I needed more than suspicion. On Tuesday, I visited him at work, bringing lunch as I occasionally did. The reception desk was staffed by someone new, a warm-faced woman in her 60s. "I'm here to see Dr. Reed," I said with a smile. "Oh, you must be Olivia," she said. "I've heard so much about you." "I'm Dorothy Parker, new department administrator." "Well, not that new anymore, 3 months now." My smile never faltered. "Nice to meet you, Dorothy." I thought Layla Jones was the administrator. Layla was promoted to the hospital board's office. Natalie Summers took over temporarily, but she's been helping with a special project for the past month. Such a lovely young woman, always going above and beyond. Dorothy's eyes crinkled with genuine admiration. "Natalie," I repeated. "I don't think Richards mentioned her." Dorothy waved her hand. "She's been working closely with the doctors on the new cardiac outreach program. Brilliant girl, only 32 and already making waves. Dr. Reed particularly values her input." "I'm sure he does," I thought. "Is Dr. Reed available?" I brought his favorite sandwich. Dorothy checked the schedule. "He's actually out of the office today. Said he had a meeting at the satellite clinic in Brookline." I nodded, hiding my surprise. Richard had texted me an hour ago about being swamped with patients all day. I must have misunderstood. I'll just leave this in his office. "Would you like me to call him?" Dorothy offered. "No need," I said smoothly. "It'll be a nice surprise." In Richard's office, I placed the sandwich on his desk alongside a note. Asterisk, missed you. Enjoy. Love, live. Asterisk, then I took a moment to look around the space I'd helped him decorate. Family photos, his medical school diploma, the small Venetian glass paperweight I'd given him on our 15th anniversary. And there, tucked beside his calendar, a small silver frame I'd never seen before. I picked it up, studying the photo of an elderly woman in a hospital bed, smiling weakly at the camera. She resembled someone, but I couldn't place who. My phone buzzed. A text from Richard. Asterisk, swamped with patients. Can't talk now. Love you. Asterisk. I took a photo of the silver frame and left. That night, I didn't mention my visit. Instead, I asked casually about his day of patient consultations, watching his face as he fabricated details about appointments that never happened. 18 years of marriage had taught me his tells, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way he rubbed his thumb against his index finger when stretching the truth. Later, as he slept, I scrolled through social media, searching for Natalie Summers from Boston Memorial. I found her easily, professional profile photo, posts about healthcare advocacy, pictures from hospital functions. And there, in a photo from a fundraising event 6 months earlier, I spotted Richard in the background, his gaze fixed on her as she addressed the crowd. I kept scrolling until I found what I was looking for. A personal photo of Natalie with an older woman in a care facility. The same woman from the silver frame in Richard's office. The caption read, asterisk 3 months of treatments and mom's still fighting. So grateful for the amazing medical team supporting us through this journey. Hashtag fuck cancer, asterisk. The pieces started falling into place. The next day, I called my attorney, Julian Barnes. Richard and I had used his services for our wills and house purchase, but Julian was my friend from university days, before I'd even met Richard. Olivia, what a pleasant surprise, his warm voice greeted me. I need to talk, Julian. Privately. Are you free for lunch? 2 hours later, we sat in a quiet corner of a restaurant 20 miles from Boston, where no one would recognize us. I think Richard is having an affair, I said after the waiter left with our orders. And I need to know my options. Julian's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes reflected concern. How certain are you? 90%. And growing more certain by the day. Do you want to save the marriage? The question hung between us. Did I? Richard and I had built a life together, weathered challenges, celebrated victories. But something had changed, not just in him, but in me. The thought of confronting him, of tearful confessions and promises to work things out, felt exhausting rather than hopeful. I want to proceed intelligently, I said finally. I need to understand exactly what's happening before I decide what I want. Julian nodded. Massachusetts is a no-fault state, but if you're thinking about divorce, evidence of adultery could impact financial settlements, especially given your sacrifices for his career. I built my life around his potential, I said, the realization crystallizing as I spoke. I delayed my career, moved cities twice, maintained our social connections, managed our home, all while he pursued his ambitions. Which makes you entitled to an equitable portion of the life you built together, Julian affirmed. But Olivia, gathering evidence needs to be done legally. No hacking emails, no recording conversations without consent. I smiled slightly. I don't need to do anything dramatic. Richard has always been meticulous about everything except covering his tracks. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a detective in my own marriage. I didn't confront Richard or change my behavior. Instead, I observed, noted patterns, and began quietly preparing. 1. I documented Richard's unexplained absences, comparing his stated whereabouts with reality. 2. I photographed credit card statements showing gifts and meals I knew nothing about. 3. I cataloged our assets, from property investments to art collections. 4. I opened a separate bank account and transferred a reasonable sum from my personal savings. 5. I researched housing options in neighborhoods across the city. And most importantly, I hired a private investigator recommended by Julian. Just follow him for 2 weeks. I instructed Terry Simmons, a former police detective with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. I need to know where he goes, who he meets, and what they do, especially when he says he's at the hospital. 10 days later, Terry delivered a thumb drive and a sympathetic look. "You were right to be suspicious," was all he said. That evening, with Richard working late again, I reviewed the evidence. Photos of him entering an apartment building in Cambridge. Footage of him and Natalie having dinner at an intimate restaurant in the North End. Images of them walking hand in hand through the public garden. But what struck me hardest were the pictures of Richard at a care facility in Wellesley, sitting beside the older woman from the photograph, Natalie's mother, reading to her as she lay in a hospital bed. In one particularly painful image, Natalie was leaning against his shoulder, his arm wrapped protectively around her as they watched her mother sleep. This wasn't just sex. It was intimacy, commitment, care. The final set of photos showed Richard at a jewelry store, examining engagement rings. Something broke and reformed inside me at that moment. Not just my heart, but my understanding of the past several years. The gradual distance. The missed anniversaries. The vague explanations. We hadn't drifted apart. He had been constructing a parallel life, piece by piece. I sat in our living room until dawn, a strange calm settling over me. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The night of the Langford Hotel Charity Gala, the moment I described earlier, was when my plan officially began. After seeing them on the balcony, I rejoined the event as if nothing had happened, making conversation with hospital board members and donors, laughing at the right moments, bidding generously during the auction. When Richard finally returned to the ballroom, I was deep in conversation with the hospital CEO. "There you are," I said warmly when Richard approached. "Dr. Winters was just telling me about the new pediatric wing. Isn't that what you've been working extra hours on?" Richard's smile faltered slightly before recovering. "Among other projects. The hospital keeps us all busy." "That it does," Dr. Winters agreed. "Your husband is an invaluable asset, Mrs. Reed. Boston Memorial wouldn't be the same without him." "I'm well aware of his value," I replied, taking Richard's arm. "I've built my life around it." Later that night, as we prepared for bed, Richard was unusually attentive, asking about my conversations at the gala, complimenting my dress, suggesting we plan a weekend getaway. "You've been working so hard lately," I said, watching his face in the mirror as I removed my earrings. "Are you sure you can take time off?" "I'll make it work," he insisted. "You deserve more of my attention." The guilt was radiating from him. I almost felt sorry for him, almost. "Actually," I said, turning to face him, "I've been thinking about visiting my sister in Chicago next weekend. You know how Amelia's been since her diagnosis. I could use a few days with her." Relief flooded his features. Of course. Family comes first. Take as much time as you need. I didn't have a sister named Amelia. I had a brother named Thomas who lived in Seattle and was perfectly healthy. But Richard's easy acceptance of my fabricated sister's illness told me everything I needed to know about how little attention he'd been paying to my life. The next morning, I called Julian. I'm ready to move forward. Are you sure? This isn't something to rush into. I've never been more certain of anything, I replied. But I want to do this my way. My way involved something Julian called a strategic dissolution, a carefully orchestrated separation that would protect my interests while giving Richard exactly what he thought he wanted: freedom. First, I transferred my curatorial position at the museum to their new Chicago satellite location, securing a significant promotion in the process. I'd been offered the role months earlier, but had declined due to Richard's career in Boston. Now, it became my escape route. Next, I began discreetly moving my personal belongings, family heirlooms, irreplaceable mementos, the art pieces that were legally mine, to a storage facility. Nothing Richard would immediately notice, but everything that truly mattered to me. Then I met with our financial advisor, ostensibly to discuss retirement planning, but actually to gain a comprehensive understanding of our investments, properties, and accounts. Richard had always managed our finances, assuring me everything was well handled. I discovered we were significantly wealthier than I'd realized, with investments in medical technology companies, real estate holdings in 3 states, and offshore accounts I'd never known existed. I documented everything meticulously. Meanwhile, I maintained absolute normalcy at home. I prepared Richard's favorite meals, listened to his stories about work, and never once mentioned Natalie or questioned his late nights. I even initiated sex more frequently, noting with bitter amusement how his guilt made him especially attentive to my pleasure. One evening, as we shared a bottle of wine on our rooftop terrace, Richard brought up the future. I've been thinking, he said, swirling the Cabernet in his glass. Maybe it's time for a change. What kind of change? I asked, heart racing despite my outward calm. My career has been all-consuming. Maybe too consuming. He reached for my hand. I was thinking, what if we took a sabbatical? Traveled for a year? Or maybe I could scale back to part-time. The irony was almost too much. Now that he was planning to leave me, he was offering what I'd wanted for years. That sounds wonderful, I lied. But what about your patients? Your research? He shrugged. Life is short. There's more to it than work. Like building a new life with your girlfriend and her mother, I thought. The following week, I flew to Chicago, not to visit a sick sister, but to finalize my new apartment lease and meet with my new museum team. When I returned 5 days later, the house felt different. Subtle changes, a pillow out of place, wine glasses in the dishwasher when we hadn't opened a bottle before I left, a faint scent that wasn't our usual home fragrance. He'd brought her to our home. Our bed. That night, I slept in the guest room, claiming jet lag. The next morning, I called Elena. It's time, I said. 2 days later, Richard arrived home to find me sitting calmly at the dining table, a single envelope before me. We need to talk, I said. He set down his briefcase, loosening his tie. Is everything all right? You've been distant since you got back from Chicago. I know about Natalie, I said simply. I know about her mother. I know about all of it. His face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, denial, fear, and finally, resignation. He sank into a chair across from me. Olivia, I raised my hand. Don't. I'm not interested in explanations or apologies. How long have you known? Long enough to make some decisions. I pushed the envelope toward him. These are divorce papers. Everything is laid out clearly. I'm keeping the Chicago property, my personal assets, and 40% of our joint investments. You keep the Boston properties, your medical patents, and the remaining investments. Clean, fair, and private. His eyes widened as he scanned the documents. You've already signed. Yes. But we should talk about this. Maybe we could. Work it out. I finished for him. Go to counseling? Rebuild trust? No, Richard. I'm not interested in fighting for someone who has already left. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, and I almost believed him. And yet, here we are. I stood up. "I'm returning to Chicago tomorrow. I've accepted the curator position I was offered last fall." "You're moving to Chicago?" He looked genuinely surprised. "Since when?" "Since I decided to start prioritizing my life the way you've prioritized yours." He stared at the papers again. "This is very generous. More than fair." Of course it was. I wanted him to sign without hesitation, without lawyers scrutinizing every detail. What he didn't know, what Julian had carefully concealed in the dense legal language, was that the agreement excluded certain assets that would only be revealed during the mandatory financial disclosure process that would follow once he signed. "I have one condition," I said. "The divorce remains private until finalized. No announcements, no changes to our social media, nothing that would create gossip at your hospital." He nodded quickly, relief washing over his features. "Of course. Whatever you need." What I needed was for him to believe he'd gotten exactly what he wanted, with minimal consequences. I left the next day, ignoring his awkward attempt at a goodbye hug. "Your attorney can contact Julian with any questions," were my parting words. From my Chicago apartment, I watched the process unfold exactly as planned. Richard signed the papers within days. The mandatory financial disclosures revealed the offshore accounts and some investments he'd forgotten to mention, which Julian immediately petitioned to include in the settlement. Richard's attorney, caught off guard by our evidence, advised him to concede rather than fight. And throughout it all, Richard maintained the pretense of our marriage publicly, even as he privately accelerated his relationship with Natalie. Through mutual friends, I learned that her mother's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Richard had become her primary physician, pulling strings to get her experimental treatments and providing care far beyond his professional obligations. 90 days after filing, our divorce was finalized. I was officially free, financially secure, and starting a new chapter in Chicago. Meanwhile, Richard continued wearing his wedding ring at work, maintaining the fiction that I was still in Chicago temporarily for a special museum project. What he didn't know was that the most crucial piece of my plan was yet to unfold. 6 weeks after our divorce was finalized, I returned to Boston for what the museum publicly announced as a major acquisition project. In reality, I came back for the Boston Memorial Hospital's annual fundraising gala, an event I'd helped organize for years and where Richard would be receiving a humanitarian award for his work developing a cardiac care program for underserved communities. I arrived fashionably late, turning heads in a crimson gown I'd never have chosen during my marriage. Elena accompanied me, providing both moral support and plausible deniability for my presence. After all, she served on the hospital's community board. Richard was across the room when I entered, deep in conversation with the hospital board. He hadn't seen me yet, but Natalie had. She stood near the bar, elegant in navy blue, her face draining of color as our eyes met. I smiled politely and made my way through the crowd, accepting greetings from old acquaintances who expressed delight at seeing me back in Boston. I could feel Natalie watching as I approached Richard from behind, tapping his shoulder lightly. "Congratulations on the award, Dr. Reed," I said when he turned. His composure shattered momentarily before he regained control. "Olivia, I didn't know you'd be here. I wouldn't miss it. Your humanitarian work deserves recognition." His eyes darted nervously around the room, landing on Natalie, who was now making her way toward us. "How's Chicago?" he asked, voice tight. "Transformative," I replied. "The museum position is everything I hoped for, and the freedom has been illuminating." Natalie reached us, hovering uncertainly at Richard's side. "Natalie," I acknowledged with a gracious nod. "Lovely to officially meet you. Richard speaks so highly of your work with the cardiac outreach program." Her surprise at my cordial tone was evident. "Mrs. Reed." "Miss Bennett, actually," I corrected gently, using my maiden name. "Richard and I finalized our divorce 3 months ago." The conversation around us stilled as nearby guests processed my words. Richard's face flushed deep red. "Olivia," he started. "Don't worry," I assured him. "I'm not here to make a scene. I simply thought it was time to end the charade. You both deserve to live your truth openly." I turned to face the growing circle of stunned onlookers, hospital board members, donors, colleagues who had known us as the perfect couple for years. For those who haven't heard, Richard and I have amicably parted ways. These things happen. But tonight isn't about personal matters. It's about celebrating the incredible work Boston Memorial does for the community. With that, I glided away, leaving behind a wake of whispers and Richard's thunderstruck expression. The remainder of the evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. I made pleasant conversation with hospital administrators and donors, many of whom awkwardly expressed sympathy while fishing for details. To each, I presented the same narrative: a mutual decision, no hard feelings, two people simply growing apart. Meanwhile, I watched from a distance as Richard attempted to maintain his composure through congratulatory conversations, his eyes repeatedly finding me across the room. When the time came for his award acceptance, his usual eloquence faltered. He spoke about compassion and care while avoiding eye contact with everyone, including Natalie, who sat rigid at a front table. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone on the same balcony where I'd discovered them months earlier. I heard the door open behind me and knew without turning who had followed me. Why tonight? Richard's voice was tight with controlled anger. Why announce it like this? I turned to face him. Because you weren't going to. How long were you planning to maintain the fiction, Richard? Until her mother passed? Until you proposed? Or were you hoping to ease into it so gradually that no one would even notice the transition? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You had no right to blindside me like that. We had an agreement. Our agreement was to keep the divorce private until finalized. It's been finalized for months, I reminded him. And yet, you're still wearing your wedding ring. He glanced down at his left hand, then quickly shoved it into his pocket. It's complicated. No, it's actually quite simple. You wanted the comfort of a new relationship without the social consequences of ending your marriage. I simply removed that convenience. You've always had to control everything, he said bitterly. Even the way our marriage ended. The comment struck me as so absurd that I laughed. Control? I spent 18 years accommodating your career, your ambitions, your schedule. I built my entire life around supporting you. And when you decided to replace me, you didn't even have the courage to end things honestly. I never planned for any of this to happen, he insisted. Natalie and I. It started as a professional relationship. Then her mother got sick and she needed support, and things just evolved. Things don't just evolve, Richard. You made choices. Every time you lied about working late. Every time you slept with her in our bed. Every time you looked at engagement rings while still married to me. Those were choices. His eyes widened. How did you know about the rings? Or about bringing her to our house? Or about the offshore account you conveniently forgot to mention during our divorce proceedings? I stepped closer. I knew everything, Richard. I just chose when and how to act on that knowledge. The door opened again, and Natalie appeared, her face tight with anxiety. Richard? Is everything all right? People are asking where you've gone. I smiled at her. Perfect timing. I was just leaving. I moved toward the door, then paused beside Natalie. How is your mother doing? The advanced lymphoma must be incredibly difficult for both of you. Her surprise at my knowledge was evident. She's fighting. The experimental treatment Dr. Harmon arranged has been helpful. Dr. Harmon? I questioned, looking back at Richard. Not Richard. Confusion crossed her face. No, Richard isn't her physician. Ethically, he couldn't be, given our relationship. Dr. Harmon is her oncologist at Dana-Farber. I nodded slowly, watching Richard's expression shift to alarm. Of course. How thoughtful of Richard to maintain those professional boundaries. He's always been so principled. With that parting blow, I left them on the balcony, making my way through the gala to find Elena. My part in the evening's drama was complete. What happened next wasn't my doing, but rather the inevitable consequences of truth finally emerging. By the following morning, the hospital grapevine was buzzing with the news of our divorce and Richard's relationship with Natalie. By afternoon, the hospital ethics committee had called an emergency meeting. By evening, Richard was facing a formal investigation into his involvement in Natalie's mother's care. Though he hadn't been her official physician, he had used his position to influence treatment decisions, access restricted medications, and circumvent normal protocols. Worse, he had done so while concealing his personal relationship with the patient's daughter. The hospital's policy was clear: any potential conflicts of interest must be disclosed immediately. Richard had not only failed to disclose his relationship, but had actively misrepresented it by continuing to wear his wedding ring and referring to me as his wife in professional settings. Within a week, Richard was suspended pending further investigation. The prestigious humanitarian award was rescinded, and the cardiac outreach program he'd championed was placed under review, its funding frozen until new leadership could be established. I watched it all unfold from Chicago, neither gloating nor intervening. This wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth finally catching up to him. 3 weeks later, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. When I opened it, Richard stood there, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice hollow. I hesitated, then stepped aside. He entered my apartment, taking in the bright, modern space that reflected my new life. No remnants of our shared past, no photographs, no mementos. Just clean lines, vibrant art, and uncluttered surfaces. "Nice place," he commented flatly. "Thank you." "Why are you here, Richard?" He sank onto my couch uninvited. "The ethics committee completed their investigation. I've been removed as department chief. The hospital board has requested my resignation." I remained standing. "I assume there are other hospitals." He laughed mirthlessly. "With an ethics violation on my record? Maybe eventually, but not at the level I was at. Not in Boston." He looked up at me. "Did you plan all of this? Was this your revenge?" "No," I answered honestly. "I didn't plan for you to violate hospital ethics policies. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own actions." "Natalie left," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Said she couldn't be with someone who'd compromised their professional integrity for her. Called it a red flag." He shook his head. "Her mother died last week." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. "Are you?" He looked up, searching my face. "You destroyed my career, my reputation." "I did no such thing," I interrupted sharply. "You lost your position because you abused it. You lost Natalie because she finally saw who you really are. And you lost me long before any of this happened. The moment you decided our marriage was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a commitment to be honored." He stood suddenly. "You know what? I came here thinking maybe there was still something worth salvaging between us. That maybe we could start over, now that everything else is gone." The audacity was so breathtaking that I could only stare at him for several seconds before finding my voice. "Let me be very clear," I said finally. "There is nothing between us anymore. Not love, not friendship, not even enough respect for me to consider rebuilding anything with you. You're here because you've lost everything else, not because you value what we had." "That's not fair," he protested. "I loved you for 18 years. No. You loved the life I helped create for you. You loved the support, the stability, the social status of our marriage. But you didn't love me enough to be honest. You didn't love me enough to end things properly before starting a new life." He stared at me, recognition slowly dawning. "You never intended to fight for our marriage, did you? Even when you first found out about Natalie, you went straight to divorce." "Because I recognized something you still don't see," I replied. "Our marriage was already over. You had already replaced me in every meaningful way. I simply acknowledged reality and chose to reclaim my life on my terms rather than wait for you to eventually discard me on yours." "And now," he asked, "what happens now?" "Now you leave," I said simply. "You go back to Boston or wherever you choose to start over, and I continue building my life here, separately." He nodded slowly, defeat evident in every line of his body. At the door, he turned back one last time. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for the affair, but for how I treated you for years before that. You deserved better." "Yes," I agreed. "I did. And now I have it." After he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and went to my balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. The night was clear, the city lights reflecting on the dark water like stars. For the first time since this all began, I allowed myself to feel everything: the grief for what was lost, the anger at his betrayal, the satisfaction of my reclaimed agency, and most of all, the profound relief of being free. 1 year later, the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art was packed for the opening of my newest exhibition, Reconstruction: Identity After Dissolution. The collection featured works by artists who had transformed personal catastrophe into creative rebirth, divorce, illness, displacement, loss, all channeled into powerful new identities. As I gave my curator's speech, I spotted Elena in the crowd, who had flown in for the opening. Beside her stood Thomas, my brother, with his wife and their teenage daughter. And scattered throughout the gallery were my new Chicago friends, colleagues who knew me only as Olivia Bennett, the dynamic curator with an eye for transformative art. No one here knew me as Richard's wife. No one defined me in relation to someone else's life or career. I had constructed this identity entirely on my own terms. After the formal presentation, as guests mingled and examined the artwork, I stepped away briefly to the museum's private balcony, needing a moment of quiet reflection. "Quite an achievement," came a voice behind me. I turned to find Julian, my attorney and friend, looking distinguished in a charcoal suit. "You came," I said, genuinely touched. "You didn't tell me you were coming. And miss your triumph?" "Never." He handed me a glass of champagne. "I brought news, too. Richard finally sold the Boston townhouse. Took a significant loss." I shrugged. "That's not my concern anymore. He's in Arizona now. Small private practice. Dating a pharmaceutical rep, according to mutual connections." "Julian," I said gently, "I appreciate the intelligence, but I genuinely don't need to know these things anymore." He studied my face. "You really have moved on." "Completely." I turned to look out at the Chicago skyline. When I left Boston, I wasn't just leaving Richard. I was leaving behind the person I'd become in that marriage, the woman who had slowly diminished herself to accommodate someone else's life. Yet you handled the end with remarkable composure. Most people in your position would have burned everything down immediately. I smiled. That would have been emotionally satisfying in the moment, but strategically short-sighted. By taking my time, by being methodical, I was able to secure not just financial independence, but a complete reinvention. That's worth more than the temporary satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation. "Still," Julian said, "when you showed up at that gala and publicly announced the divorce, that was a masterstroke." It wasn't about hurting him, I clarified. It was about reclaiming my narrative. As long as he controlled the story of our separation, I remained defined by his choices. By taking that control away, I freed myself completely. Inside, the exhibition continued, voices and music spilling out onto the balcony. Elena appeared at the door, waving me back in. "Olivia, the Tribune critic wants to talk to you." I nodded to her and turned back to Julian. The ironic thing is, Richard thought he was escaping something by pursuing Natalie, the constraints of our marriage, perhaps, or his own aging, or simply the weight of a shared history he no longer valued. But in the end, he lost everything he'd built, while I discovered I could build something entirely new. "From the ashes," Julian observed. "No," I corrected him, finishing my champagne. "Not from ashes. From my own foundation, one that was always there, just waiting to support whatever life I chose to create." As we rejoined the exhibition, I was stopped repeatedly by attendees praising the collection and my curatorial vision. Several mentioned how the theme of reconstruction resonated deeply with their own experiences. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the cleanup crew was at work, I walked alone through the gallery, studying each piece one final time before closing. I paused before my favorite installation, a shattered mirror reassembled into a kaleidoscopic self-portrait, beautiful not despite its fractures, but because of them. The artist had named it simply, After. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. **Breakfast tomorrow? So proud of you tonight. **. I smiled and replied, Asterisk, absolutely. My treat. And thank you for being there for all of it. Asterisk. As I left the museum that night, I thought about the many forms of love and loyalty I'd experienced. Elena's steadfast friendship, Julian's protective guidance, my brother's quiet support, and yes, even the 18 years with Richard that, despite their painful ending, had shaped me in ways I could now appreciate from a distance. I had loved Richard truly. I had built a life with him in good faith. And when that life crumbled, I had found the strength to build another, one that reflected my own values, ambitions, and capacity for joy. That wasn't revenge. It was rebirth. And as I walked home through the Chicago night, wrapped in the cool lake breeze and the soft glow of city lights, I felt nothing but gratitude for the painful awakening that had led me here, to this moment, this freedom, this hard-won peace that no one could take from me again. Some might call it winning. I simply called it living, finally, completely on my own terms.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.